Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Ghost FM USA. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. And I'm an AI narrator, so if I mispronounce anything, please forgive me. Now, let's begin. Sydney Wallace, through no fault of his own, arrived at the office late for the second time in 5 days. He told his boss, Wilshire, about the gruesome accident on the interstate that stalled his commute for 45 minutes. "I don't want to hear your excuses," the furious man shouted. "I don't care if Einstein came back from the dead," stood in the middle of the freeway, and handed out IQ points. "If your sorry excuse for an ass is late one more time, you're fired." After stalking back to his desk, Sidney dropped heavily into his uncomfortable chair. A long, demanding day loomed ahead of him. The blood-red numbers on his digital clock already showed 8:47 a.m. He had only 6 hours until he made his presentation to the board of directors. Unwittingly, he flashed back to the twisted mess of metal and blood splattered across I-35. He narrowly avoided adding to the 5-car pileup. When the tiny Corvette ahead of him slammed on the brakes, he'd swerved out of the way. The driver of the black Ferrari, he cut off Blair on the horn and blew past him. The tiny Corvette slid under a flatbed trailer. Sidney sighed. He needed to put the horrible experience out of his mind for now. If he couldn't dazzle the board and prove his worth to the company, Wilshire would likely fire him. He already warned Sidney several times about his low and substandard productivity and lack of motivation. Wilshire was a jerk. Sidney pulled the flash drive containing his presentation out of his pocket and plugged it into the computer. As he reached for the keyboard so he could log on, his large, overly clumsy hand knocked over a nearby styrofoam cup. The remains of yesterday's coffee flowed across the desk. Soaking papers, pens, his mouse, his keys, and he only printed a draft of his presentation. The cold, brown liquid finally rushed into his lap and soaked the crotch of his pants. Yelping in surprise, he banged his knee on the side of his desk. The cup couldn't possibly have held the volume of coffee that poured out of it. Frantically, he shoved his papers out of the way, but it was too late. He dried off his desk, then threw the ruined pages and soggy tissues toward the garbage. The already overflowing can's precarious tower of slimy banana peels, half-empty cans of soda, wadded up piles of paper, and other detritus toppled to the carpet. "You gotta be kidding me. I can't do this right now," he hissed. He reached down to pick up the trash and stuff it back into the can. As he leaned down, the seam at the back of his pants gave way with a loud RIP. Great, now what? He couldn't deliver his presentation to the directors with a giant hole in the rear of his pants. "Don't panic," he told himself. He opened the top drawer of his desk and reached inside. Maybe he could find something to fix the torn fabric. As he rummaged through his supplies, his fingers plunged into a large, sticky wad of gum. What in the world was gum doing there? He never chewed gum. Gross. He wiped the offensive glob against the edge of his desk with a shudder. With a sudden, frantic spark of inspiration, he grabbed his stapler, bent over at the waist, reached around himself, and awkwardly stapled the torn fabric of his pants back together. It was a pathetic but effective solution. Now, finally, he could stop wasting time and get to work. He needed to go over his presentation, so he didn't look like a blithering idiot in front of the directors. Thanks to the coffee debacle, he had to print out another copy. He typed in his password, 1GUDGOLF ER. An error message beeped loudly on the screen, announcing that his password was invalid. He entered again, slowly. A loud, angry, computerized voice angrily shouted that it was still invalid. How can a computer sound angry? Sidney wondered. I must be imagining things. Witnessing that accident must have stressed him out more than he realized. Grinding his teeth, he dialed the information technology department. A sweet, automated female voice thanked him for his patience. She informed him that all technicians were busy, but if he would please leave his name, extension, department, supervisor's name, supervisor's extension, zodiac sign, and a brief description of the problem, someone would get back to him as soon as possible. Fuming, Sidney said, "This is Sid Wallace. My extension is 437. My password isn't working. It's giving me an invalid password error message. Call me ASAP. This is urgent." The automated voice instructed him to begin recording his message at the tone, biting his lip hard enough to draw blood. He repeated the message and hung up. Looking at his computer screen, he growled, "I should win an award for my patience." The phone rang instantly. Scowling, he answered, "Wallace." "Hey, Waldorf. This is Ted from IT. I understand you're having some trouble figuring out how to use your password," he said in a bored, condescending voice. "Have you tried retyping your password?" Was this idiot kidding? Sidney bit down on his tongue to keep from calling Ted bad names. He needed his help, even if his tolerance level for grief from the IT department was an all-time low. A warm trickle of blood on his tongue and a rapidly swelling lip did nothing to improve his mood. "Yes, I've retyped it." "Type it again." Marveling again at his own patience, he typed his password. "I tried. Again. That isn't the problem." Ted droned on with complete seriousness. "Is your computer turned on?" "Of course my computer's turned on. How else would I know my password doesn't work?" Beads of sweat began forming on Sidney's face. "Is the screen turned on? Are you even listening to me?" Sidney asked tightly. "Of course, Waldinger. We're here to help. Try retyping your password." Sidney slammed the phone down in frustration. He planned to find the IT department later and pay Ted a little visit. He'd knock the teeth from his snide little mouth. First, though, he needed to get access to his computer. As a last, desperate resort, he typed his password again. His home screen finally popped up. However, instead of showing the usual picture of three bikini-wearing beauties on a beach, the background now featured an erupting volcano. "Very funny, Ted. We'll talk later." Shaking his head in exasperation, he clicked on the program to bring up the presentation. Amazing, he thought, the way this day is going. I'm surprised the file is even here. A message appeared on the screen. File opening 10%, 15%, 25%, 26%. Sidney pulled the handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped off his forehead. His foot started tapping. The metallic taste of blood lingered in his mouth. While he waited for his file to open, he leaned around the cubicle's partition to ask his co-worker if her computer was acting up. The petite redhead was wearing a headset and clicking through data on a spreadsheet, although she was wearing wool pants and a heavy jacket. She reached down and turned up her space heater. "Are you kidding me? Piss Melissa?" he whispered loudly. She turned to him, eyes bugging out, and gestured at her phone. I know you're on a call. Could you just turn your heater down a bit? She rolled her eyes and shook her head, then returned her attention to her computer. Fine, he thought. He pressed the switch to turn his desk fan on full blast. Nothing happened. Looking under his desk, he saw the cord laying on the ground. Groaning, he leaned down and plugged the fan back in. Behind himself, he heard R.I.P. Sidney swore viciously. The hole in the back of his pants had doubled in size. He'd need to get more staples from the office supply room. The screen showed his file was 33% loaded. He squeezed his eyes shut and counted to 10. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the switch on his oscillating fan. Once again, nothing happened. Looking at the ground, he saw the cord was not plugged into the wall. He must have snagged it with his foot and pulled it loose. With a grunt, he jammed the plug back into the outlet and turned the fan on. Blessed, sweet air blew immediately onto his sweaty face. Sighing, he noticed the computer screen. File opening, 98%. Maybe this day could be salvaged after all. The screen went dark. Judging by the sudden outbreak of swearing in Spanish, English, and Hindi in the nearby cubicles, Sidney concluded a circuit breaker must have blown. He picked up the phone, squeezing the receiver in a failed attempt to control his frustration. A guy named Chuck answered his call to the building's maintenance department. "Good morning, Chuck," Sidney said tightly. "It looks like we've blown a breaker here on the 26th floor. I'm on the north side of the building." "You're out of luck, pal. The guy who flips the breakers is out sick today," said Chuck in a heavy Brooklyn accent. Sidney closed his eyes before replying. "So have someone else do it," he said between clenched teeth. "Sorry, pal. Union rules. Can't do another man's job." Chuck hung up the phone. Dropping the phone on his desk, Sidney slid back in his chair. He wiped some more sweat from his forehead, then got up to go to the electrical room. He'd flipped the breaker himself. The guy who flips the breakers. He thought incredulously, does that lazy prick expect me to believe there's only one guy here who flips the breakers? It took around 15 minutes to find the electrical control room, locate the breaker panel, and reset the switch that had tripped. When he got back to his desk, he realized he'd forgotten to stop at the supply room for staples. Whatever. One of his drawers held a roll of duct tape. He'd make it work. Returning to his cubicle, Sidney turned his computer back on and reinitiated the slow process of opening his slide presentation. After securing the back of his pants with carefully placed strips of gray tape, he decided to get some water. He walked quickly toward the break room, glancing at his diamond-studded watch. The face of the watch proclaimed 8:35. Great. "The battery's dead," he muttered. His pants pulled at the awkwardly repaired and re-repaired seam, so he walked slowly with his legs close together. He looked up just in time to see the very wide eyes of Alicia, the intern from the accounting department, as she collided with him. Folders and papers went flying, and her coffee doused the front of his shirt. "Watch out!" he shrieked as he lost his footing and tackled her to the ground. Several nearby co-workers rushed to her aid. "Watch where you're going, you giant oaf," Huff with suits as he helped Alicia to her feet. "Girl, you need to eschew his ass," said Melissa, the redhead from the cubicle next to his. "What? Misogynistic punk. Thinking he can just walk wherever he wants to. Like you don't have a right to be here." A woman with brown skin and braids hanging to her lower back leaned over Sidney. "I got my eye on you, bitch." Mutters and stifled laughter met his ears as he got up and hurried around the corner. "Did you see the back of his pants?" A woman's voice drifted after him. Yeah, the cheapskate can't even buy new clothes when he needs them. Every muscle in his body was tense as Sidney entered the break room and headed straight for the sink. He grabbed some paper towels and dabbed at his soiled shirt, sighing defeat at the pointless endeavor. He picked up a styrofoam cup and filled it with water from the water cooler. As he lifted the cup to his lips, the styrofoam cracked from his overly intense grip, and cold water ran down his face to his shirt. "I've had it," he yelled to the empty break room. "I'm going home. I dare anyone to try stopping me." He threw the remains of the cup at the sink and marched out into the hallway. "To hell with all of you," he growled at the small crowd standing around Alicia. He stomped across the office to the elevator while ignoring the looks of amusement from the people whose cubicles he passed. "To hell with all of you, too," he snapped, pointing a finger at each mocking face. He stood at the elevator and jammed the down button with his thumb. He was wearing more coffee than he normally drank. Sweat poured off him like he was a perspiration fountain. Even his hair was soaked. Turning around, he noticed every cubicle in sight had a space heater. "It must be 85 degrees in here," he whined in a high-pitched voice. "What the hell is wrong with you people?" Every eye in the room stared back at him with mixed looks of amusement, irritation, or indignation. He shook his head. "For this, I'm still paying on student loans," he mumbled. He stepped into the elevator when it finally arrived. The vomitous smell of flatulence, left by someone in need of immediate medical attention, assaulted his nostrils. He pushed G for the ground floor, then pinched his nostrils together. The door slid shut. The elevator rushed down 2 floors, then jerked to a stop. The door slid open to admit 2 overly perky teenagers. They wore pristine white tennis dresses and carried rackets. They stared at him judgmentally as they noticed the unfortunate odor. "Rude," said one of them in a drawn-out, sing-song voice. "It wasn't me," Sidney snapped. "Sure, dude," said the other one. Turning to whisper to her friend, the door slid shut. The elevator rushed down 4 floors, then stopped suddenly a second time. A man with a white service dog got in. The dog sniffed the air and whimpered. The door slid shut. The elevator rushed down 3 more floors, then stopped. 3 women wearing business suits got in, and the teenagers got out. Sidney felt nauseated. He looked at the elevator's digital display. 17 floors to go. Once again, the door slid shut. Sidney tried convincing his stomach to settle. He shouldn't have eaten that 3rd donut for breakfast, but he'd figured he wouldn't have time for lunch. The elevator seemed to pick up speed as it descended. After 10 floors, it stopped so suddenly one of the businesswomen lost her balance and fell against her colleagues. The women hastily left the elevator, and 4 pale, dark-haired men in black suits got in. The quartet stood in a row and stared at Sidney with vacant eyes. Sidney looked straight ahead at the doors and tried not to squirm. The uncomfortable situation didn't help his nausea. When they finally reached the ground floor, Sidney took 2 steps out of the elevator and ran straight into Mr. Lentil, the building superintendent. As he opened his mouth to apologize, his stomach succumbed to the day's stress. Sidney vomited on the man's freshly shined and obviously expensive shoes. Lentil, who stood 6 feet 4 inches and weighed about 230 pounds, looked down at the decorative remains of Sidney's last couple meals. Last night's chocolate fudge strawberry supreme pie wouldn't be adding to his waistline, at least. "You're coming with me, you degenerate thug," grunted Lentil as he grabbed Sidney's arm. "Sidney!" feeling somewhat better after the sudden, violent purge, blurted the first words that came to mind. "Sorry, wrong floor." The superintendent yanked him away from the elevator. "I don't care. You're coming to my office and cleaning off my dash." "Can't, my man. I'm late for a presentation." Sidney twisted out of the giant's grip and fled back into the elevator. "Hey!" yelled the indignant superintendent. Sidney leaned against the farthest corner of the elevator and smirked as the doors closed. Getting away from his cubicle for a bit put everything in perspective, and he started to relax. Storming out of the building would have cost him his job. He'd give the presentation, and everything would be fine. He wasn't the first person to ruin their clothes before a big meeting. With any luck, he'd even have a chance to dim the lights. A small, frail-looking, silver-haired woman with a cane stood in front of the number panel. She was going to the 40th floor. Sidney collected himself and asked politely, "Could you please press 26? She raised her crooked, wrinkled middle finger and didn't budge. Feeling his last thread of self-control snap, he grabbed her and shoved her away from the control panel. With his attention fully focused on reaching the circular button, he failed to notice the woman's hand digging into her pocket. With astonishing speed, she pulled out a small black aerosol bottle and sprayed him in the face. Coughing, gagging, and screaming, Sidney fell to the floor. "That'll teach you, you fat creep," the old woman shouted in a crackled, long-time smoker's voice. Sputtering, he managed, "I'm just trying to get to my office." The elevator stopped on the second floor, and the door slid open. For the first time since he was 12 years old, Sidney began to sob. The tears stung his already violated face. A young, professionally dressed couple looked from Sidney to the snarling old woman. "We'll take the next one," they said in unison. The elevator wobbled up to the third floor. A man with pale skin, a long black cape, and teeth filed down as sharp points came through the doors. Sidney wondered if the blood on the cracked corner of his mouth was from another person. On the fourth floor, a woman with elegant makeup and a parrot on her shoulder strode in and stood to the right of Sidney. "Jackass," the parrot said. "It's Beady Black I met Sidney's." "Jackass," it repeated. Sidney's still stinging face was undoubtedly red and blotchy. His right eye was beginning to swell shut. "Maybe that'll keep the director's attention off my torn pants," he thought. Ironic, a delivery man was waiting on the fifth floor. He wheeled in a cart that held a box roughly shaped like a coffin. Morbidly, Sidney wondered if it held the remains of the Corvette driver from this morning's accident. The delivery man turned the cart around and backed up to stand right in front of Sidney. Sidney yelped involuntarily as he stomped on his feet. "Move it," the delivery man griped. "Jackass," said the parrot. Sidney didn't bother responding. He was too tired. The elevator stopped on every floor. Sidney realized that although people were getting in, no one was getting out. The air became stale, and Sidney wondered how many more people the elevator could hold. It had to be approaching the weight limit. He'd been standing there for at least 25 minutes. At this rate, he'd miss his meeting with the directors. Restless and panicky, he glanced at his watch. 8:35. Damn, he forgot the battery was dead. "Anyone have the time?" he asked. "Jackass," replied the parrot. No one else said anything. The parrot's owner wore earbuds and was utterly oblivious to her bird's vulgar comments. On the 10th floor, two middle-aged women joined the group. "I'm telling you," said the first one, "that boy is bad news." He'll have Sabrina knocked up in no time." "Sabrina, ha!" answered the second woman. Sydney cringed at the shrill tone of her voice. That little slut deserves what she gets. She slept with half the boys in town, and a few of the girls. I've even heard she's had abortions. Absolutely scandalous. The elevator lurched to a stop. Sydney's nausea returned with a vengeance, and the loud, judgmental gossip session didn't help. A girl with a large boa constrictor wrapped around her body squeezed in next to the pair of women, who looked at her disapprovingly. People who bring exotic pets into public spaces are rather rude, don't you think, Marla? Biddy number one said to her friend. The girl turned to glare at the women, and the snake hissed. Sydney didn't think Snake Girl looked like someone to mess with. Marla sniffed. Vampire Guy checked out Snake Girl with obvious interest. As that drama unfolded, the elevator stopped on the 12th floor and picked up a big, burly, sweaty man with a toolbox. He smelled of acrid sweat and urine. Incredibly, no one else seemed bothered by the horrendous odor. The tennis girls would have passed out, he thought. Sydney decided to get out on the next floor and take a different elevator. He just had to figure out how to get past the livery guy. He shifted his weight to the left and tried to see around him. He would have to plow his way around a few people, but he didn't care. The elevator was definitely past its weight capacity. Sydney waited while the elevator ascended. The sound of the groaning motor made him nervous, but at long last, they made progress toward the 26th floor. Sydney realized that also meant they were getting further from the ground. If the cables holding their car gave out, they'd have no chance of survival. He felt like he'd been buried alive. After several more seconds, the elevator stopped. Sydney figured they'd reached at least the 20th floor. However, when the doors opened, the screen overhead flashed the number 14. Maybe someone was playing a practical joke on him. Maybe he was on one of those reality shows where they pranked unsuspecting people. What if one of these weirdos was filming him, or there was a camera in the elevator? He closed his eyes. I will not succumb to paranoia. A man with a spiked mohawk and a wide, toothy grin strode into the elevator. He carried a butcher knife. His leather jacket had silver spikes sticking 3 inches off the shoulders. To Sydney's horror, but certainly not surprise, the man pushed his way to the back of the elevator and stood at Sydney's left side. "Suck my cock," commanded the parrot. The man leaned down until he was inches from Sydney's face. "What did you say to me?" He continued grinning like a maniac. This is it, Sydney thought. A stranger is going to murder me in an elevator because of a rude bird. It wasn't Dash, she stuttered. "Suck my cock," the bird repeated. It hopped on Sydney's shoulder and relieved itself. Warm, greenish-yellow ooze slid down his shirt. The man on his left continued to grin, with his horrible teeth and putrid breath. Sydney shoved the bird off his shoulder. "Jackass, suck my cock." Maybe the elevator cables would break, and he could fall to his death and finally get some peace. This was like an express elevator to hell. He wanted to scream, but he knew if he started, he wouldn't be able to stop. They arrived on the 15th floor. People were already packed together like sardines, but somehow a young mother with a crying baby and a wailing 3-year-old squeezing with them. "Mama," the toddler screamed. "Mama, mama, mama, mama." "Suck my cock," the parrot demanded. "Your mama sucks my cock." Marla, speaking loudly so her companion could hear her over the chaos, complained about a neighbor's dog who kept digging up her flower bed. Grinning Guy sneezed on Sydney, and continued grinning. On the 16th floor, an Elvis impersonator got in. The old woman with the pepper spray and bad attitude held the door open for him. "Thank you," he said in a perfect imitation of Elvis. "Thank you very much." Sidney couldn't take any more. His sanity had been slowly deteriorating for about 7 floors now. He roared, the adrenaline-fueled burst of anger exploding from his lungs in an almost visible cloud of energy. Startled passengers raised their eyebrows or giggled. Sidney shoved his way through the wall of bodies. The doors slammed shut just before he reached them. They stopped on the 17th floor. The doors opened, revealing a brick wall. Hysterical laughter erupted from his mouth. Tears and snot erupted from other orifices, and the others on the elevator began shirking away from him. He clapped his hands. "Good one, guys. Good one." By the time they reached the 20th floor, he pulled himself together. He used his handkerchief to clean off his face, taking great care to avoid his swollen eye and irritated skin. The elevator doors opened, and he flung himself into the lobby. He landed on his hands and knees in front of a group of men and women in military uniforms. They looked at him disdainfully, then walked around him and got in the elevator. As the elevator doors closed, he heard the bird cheerfully shout out, "Jackass!" He stood up, checked that his pants were still somewhat repaired, and looked at his surroundings. The immaculate hallways, leading in 3 different directions that formed a T, looked the same as those on most of the other floors. Closed doors flanked the plain walls. The hum of a cluster of vending machines was the only sound. An acquaintance from the purchasing department strolled by and nodded at him. Sidney walked to the lone window and looked out at the dreary day. Maybe the constant stress of the job was finally breaking him. He knew the human resources office hadn't moved from the 17th floor. He'd obviously hallucinated the brick wall. Maybe it was time to think about switching careers. The stairwell was just to the left of the elevator. Climbing 6 floors would probably be the fastest and least stressful option. Sidney pushed against a metal bar on the door to gain access to the stairwell and began to climb up. By the time he reached the 22nd floor, he was feeling the effects of his lack of regular exercise. His breath came in wheezy gasps and colored spots danced through his field of vision. His heart fluttered like the wings of a panicked bird. Gulping air as he passed the 24th floor, he leaned forward and half-crawled up the stairs. When he reached the 26th floor, he wondered if he could get to his desk before he passed out. With his eyes watering and still half shut, his rubbery legs made their way uneventfully through the office to his cubicle. He collapsed into his chair and slid immediately off the front of it. The chair rolled out from underneath him, dumping him on the floor with a graceless thud. The remaining staples in his pants dug into his skin, and he felt tiny spots of warm blood soak into his underwear. His computer screen showed that his presentation file was 98% loaded. Swiping at his eyes, he looked at the time on his desk phone's LED display. It showed 9:15 a.m. That's simply not possible, he thought. I've been in this building for at least 3 hours. But the phone, his digital clock, and the computer system all agreed. He hadn't even been here an hour. Looking again at his expensive watch, he noticed one of the diamonds was missing from its setting. He began to laugh and found himself unable to stop. Melissa, the girl across the aisle, told him to shut up so she could concentrate. Wallace, keep it down over there. His supervisor appeared out of nowhere and hovered over him. Sidney began to offer a scathing reply. when he noticed the title slide of his presentation appear on his computer screen. It read, "How to increase productivity and avoid wasting time on the clock." The irony would have sent him into more gales of hysterical laughter, but he envisioned himself standing unprepared in front of all the suits in the boardroom and came back to his senses. His supervisor scoffed and moved on. He scrolled through the slides, familiarizing himself with the information. We could increase productivity by 135% simply by stretching out the length of an hour, he said to no one in particular. This time he couldn't stop the fit of giggles until he heard his supervisor's footsteps heading back toward his cubicle. He quickly cleared his throat and continued looking through the file until the shrill ringing of his telephone interrupted him. "Wallace," he answered. A deep voice shouted, "You're late? The board is waiting. Get your ass down here or you're fired." The line went dead. "But that's impossible." Sidney howled, looking at the time. It read 3:02. He should have had hours to prepare yet. Had he fallen asleep? No, he hadn't. Standing up and looking around the office, he saw everyone diligently working at their computers or talking with co-workers. Why hadn't anyone else noticed weird things happening? He didn't have the luxury of taking time to find out. Quickly, he resaved his presentation to his flash drive and raced to the boardroom. He pulled open the heavy wooden doors. 12 sets of eyes stared at him coldly. Apologize for my appearance. It's been a trying day. You were late to work, and you were late to this meeting. What do you have to say for yourself?" demanded his boss. He put out a cigarette in the ashtray in front of him. "I'm sorry. Let me get the file upload going, so as not to waste any more of your time," Sidney said nervously. He dropped the flash drive on the plush red carpet, and they laughed. He felt an angry flush heat his face as he picked up the tiny device. He inserted it into the laptop on the table and opened his file. The title page of his presentation appeared on the giant screen at the head of the room. He cleared his throat. "Today," he began, "I'd like to present to you the findings of my study on how to increase productivity." He clicked to the first slide. Anger swelled in him as everyone in the room began to laugh again. Looking behind him, he saw that someone had tampered with his file. A gory photograph replaced a chart he'd painstakingly created. "Hey, who changed my file?" he yelped in a high-pitched, panicked voice. "What the hell is that?" He gestured forcefully at the photo displayed on the screen. "Don't you recognize it? Look more closely," instructed a man sitting at the far end of the table. Sidney couldn't make him out in the dim light, and he didn't recognize his voice. He looked at the screen. "Oh, God!" Sidney said in astonishment. "That's the accident I saw this morning. That's the reason I was late." The directors laughed harder. A few laughed so hard they gasped for breath. Finally, the man shrouded in darkness spoke. "Wallace," the deep voice said, "that accident is not the reason you were late. That accident is the reason you are dead." Sweat poured from Sidney and stung his widening eyes. Realization struck him like 1,000 volts of electricity. Stumbling, he ran toward the door. As he reached for the door handle, it disappeared. A brick wall stood where the door had been. As he whimpered, he heard more shrieking laughter from the board. His boss composed himself enough to ask, "What's the matter, Wallace? Aren't you enjoying hell?"